These are 10 Hollywood stars who walked onto a film set one day and discovered they'd been fired, replaced, erased from projects they'd poured weeks or even years of work into. Number 1. George Cukor in Gone with the Wind, 1939. One of the most anticipated films ever made, lost its director after just 18 days of shooting. George Cukor had devoted nearly 2 years to pre-production on Gone with the Wind, overseeing screen tests and developing the characters of Scarlett and Rhett from the ground up. Principal photography launched on January 26, 1939, and 18 days later, the studio showed him the door. Vivien Leigh and Olivia de Havilland were still in costume, filming the Atlanta bazaar scene, when news of the firing reached them. Both actresses marched directly to David O. Selznick's office and begged him to reconsider, but he wouldn't budge. The official explanation pointed to a series of disagreements over individual scenes, which told only part of the story. Selznick visited the set constantly and offered what Cukor called unasked-for opinions, and that interference drove the director to distraction. Cukor wanted Sidney Howard's original screenplay, while Selznick insisted on his own rewritten version, and that clash sealed the outcome. Years later, Cukor looked back on it with dry wit and recalled arriving at the studio the morning after the firing. He said he amused himself by observing who spoke to him and who pretended not to see him, and he thought to himself that now he knew who would come to his funeral. Victor Fleming stepped in as replacement, but he clashed badly with the actresses and allegedly told Vivien Leigh she could stick the script up her royal British ass. Fleming nearly collapsed from exhaustion and had to be temporarily replaced by Sam Wood, which meant 3 directors ultimately shot the picture. Cukor's career suffered no lasting damage from the experience. Getting fired freed him to direct The Women and the Philadelphia Story, and he won the Academy Award for Best Director for My Fair Lady in 1964. Number 2. Bette Davis in The Warner Bros. Rebellion, 1936. This one shows what happens when a star fights back against the system. Bette Davis had just won the Academy Award for Dangerous in 1936, and Warner Brothers rewarded her with assignments she considered absolute garbage. They put her in Satan Met a Lady and God's Country and The Woman, and when she refused to make that second picture, the studio suspended her without pay for 3 months. That's when Davis did something that took real courage and accepted an offer from an Italian producer for 2 European films at £20,000. She and her husband fled to Canada to avoid being served legal papers, then sailed to England to escape the studio's reach. Warner Brothers responded with an injunction prohibiting her from working anywhere in the world. The trial became a sensation in the British press. Sir Patrick Hastings, Jack Warner's famous barrister, opened by mocking her as a rather naughty young lady who simply wanted more money. He ridiculed her claim that her contract amounted to slavery when she earned over $1,000 per week, and the argument landed. Davis lost the case and returned to Hollywood broke and humiliated. What happened next surprised everyone. Warner Brothers paid her court costs along with Jack Warner's legal fees and her own lawyer's $10,000 retainer, and then they started giving her better scripts. By 1939, Life magazine called her undoubtedly the ablest US-born movie actress, and she won her 2nd Oscar for Jezebel. They started calling her the 5th Warner brother. Her rebellion paved the way for Olivia de Havilland's successful 1943 lawsuit, which established the de Havilland Law, limiting studio contracts to 7 years. Number 3. Judy Garland in Annie Get Your Gun, 1949. Studio memos captured this firing in chilling detail. On May 10, 1949, Judy Garland phoned her assistant director at 7:30 in the morning and told him she'd overslept after a very bad night. They talked for 15 minutes before she said she felt better and would come in late. She arrived at 10:10 a.m., went through makeup, appeared on set without costume while complaining of a severe migraine, and tried to rehearse "I'm an Indian Too" until just before noon when production stopped for lunch. That afternoon, MGM ended her involvement in the picture. The studio memo read that Judy Garland's contract had been suspended and that she was not to be called or requested to render services of any kind whatsoever. Someone was sent to convince her to come back, and her response was final. She told them she would never come back, now or ever. $1.25 million in footage had already been scrapped by that point, and MGM had paid a record $650,000 for the Broadway rights. Garland was suffering from severe depression and receiving electroshock therapy while battling addiction to the amphetamines and sleeping pills that MGM had given her since childhood. She later explained the cycle by saying they'd give pep pills and then take everyone to the studio hospital and knock them cold with sleeping pills, and that's the way they got mixed up and lost contact. Betty Hutton came in as her replacement, and the cast treated Hutton coldly, as if they blamed her for what happened to Garland. $8 million in domestic earnings made it MGM's biggest musical hit of 1950. Number 4. Vivien Leigh in Elephant Walk, 1953. Two-time Oscar winner Vivien Leigh landed the lead in Paramount's Elephant Walk in 1953, a film set amid Ceylon's tea plantations. Paramount originally wanted her husband Laurence Olivier as co-star, but his theater commitments made that impossible. Leigh suggested her lover Peter Finch instead, and Finch happened to be Olivier's own protege. Filming began in Ceylon in February 1953, and according to biographer Alexander Walker, the moist, sensuous heat of the location began affecting Vivien deeply. Her latent manic depression surfaced, and she began striking mock-erotic poses while vamping the director and fluffing her lines in ways that were very unusual for her. The producer appealed to Finch for help, but even Finch grew unsettled when Vivien started calling him Larry. She sent increasingly erratic postcards to Olivier, including requests like, "Bring me my evening dresses," but Olivier was in Italy with his mistress and never received them. On March 18, 1953, the Associated Press reported that Vivien Leigh was dropping out of Elephant Walk and returning to England because of an acute nervous breakdown. Olivier arrived at the airport and told reporters not to get too close to her because she was ill and might get frightened. Elizabeth Taylor stepped into the role at just 21 years old, and she wore a longer haircut to match the salon footage already shot with Leigh. If you know where to look, Leigh's distinctive cheekbones remain visible in the final film. Vivien Leigh responded graciously that July and told interviewers not to blame the elephants, adding that she hoped Elizabeth Taylor would be very good in the part. She made only 3 more films after age 40. Number 5. Marilyn Monroe in Something's Got to Give, 1962. This firing became the defining tragedy of Hollywood's studio era, a death sentence delivered by memo. Marilyn Monroe showed up for only 12 of 32 scheduled shooting days on Something's Got to Give while suffering from sinusitis, fevers reaching 102 degrees, and chronic health issues. On May 19, 1962, she left production to sing "Happy Birthday, Mr. President" to JFK at Madison Square Garden, and the studio was furious. She sent director George Cukor a telegram that read, "Dear George, please forgive me. It was not my doing. I had so looked forward to working with you." June 8, 1962, brought her termination. The producer announced that Marilyn had completely flouted professional discipline and was responsible for putting 104 crew members out of work, and Fox filed a $750,000 lawsuit against her for breach of contract. Lee Remick received the job offer that same day, but Dean Martin had contractual approval over his leading lady and refused the replacement. His exact words were that he had signed to do the picture with Marilyn Monroe and would do it with no one else. Kim Novak turned down the role out of respect for Monroe, and Shirley MacLaine and Doris Day also declined. Fox suspended production indefinitely. Monroe launched a publicity counteroffensive through a flurry of interviews. In her famous Life magazine interview, published August 3, 1962, she reflected that fame is fickle and that she now lived in her work and in a few relationships with the few people she could really count on. That interview ran one day before her death. Fox eventually rehired her on August 1st, offering $250,000 plus $500,000 for a second film. Production was set to resume in October, but she died 3 days after signing that new deal. She was 36 years old. Number 6. Peter Sellers in Kiss Me, 1964. Peter Sellers had spent 6 weeks filming Billy Wilder's Kiss Me Stupid when everything collapsed on the night of April 5th, 1964. He suffered between 8 and 13 heart attacks over 3 hours and was pronounced clinically dead for approximately 90 seconds before doctors revived him. The heart attacks were triggered by inhaling amyl nitrite as a sexual stimulant with his new wife, Britt Eklund, whom he'd married just 10 days before filming. Sellers later admitted that when a 38-year-old bloke marries a 21-year-old bird, he needs all the help he can get. During his clinical death, Sellers experienced something that changed him. He described feeling himself leave his body and floating out of his physical form while watching them cart his body away to the hospital. Billy Wilder's response was legendarily cold. Upon hearing of the heart attacks, he reportedly asked what they meant by heart attack and said, "You've got to have a heart before you can have an attack." Wilder refused to wait out the 6-month recovery period, and Ray Walston took over the role. Every frame of Sellers' footage was reshot, and none of it survives today. Wilder later admitted that Walston lacked the manic energy Sellers brought to the character. The Catholic Legion of Decency condemned the picture, and it became one of Wilder's biggest commercial failures. Sellers returned to work and went on to make What's New Pussycat while continuing the Pink Panther franchise. Another major heart attack hit him in 1977, and a massive one killed him in July 1980 at age 54. Number 7. Judy Garland in Valley of the Dolls, 1967. Judy Garland appears on this list twice, which tells you everything about how Hollywood treated her. February 1967 brought a contract with 20th Century Fox to play Helen Lawson, the tough Broadway legend in Valley of the Dolls, for $75,000 across 8 weeks with $25,000 per week after that. This was supposed to be her comeback. At the press conference, Garland showed her characteristic self-awareness and said the role called for an old pro over 40, and that's exactly what she was, adding that she was certainly no longer Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. The production fell apart almost immediately. Co-star Patty Duke later called director Mark Robson the meanest son of a bitch she'd ever met in her life, and the treatment of Garland proved her point. Garland had to arrive at 6:30 a.m., but Robson wouldn't plan to use her until 4 in the afternoon. According to Duke, enablers plied Garland with alcohol during those long hours of waiting. April 27, 1967, brought her termination, and Fox announced she had resigned for personal reasons. Garland denied this and stated she did not resign and had been ready to film at 6 a.m. that day. She quipped that the studio hadn't even built the set yet, but the tabloids had her walking off it. Patty Duke offered the most damning assessment of the whole situation. She said the producers may have felt justified in hiring Garland in the first place because they'd gotten their PR mileage out of it. The Judy comeback stories had created extraordinary publicity for the film, and now she was expendable. Susan Hayward replaced her, and Garland walked away with 50% of her promised fee at $37,500, along with the copper-sequined Travilla pantsuit designed for the role. She wore that costume during her final Palace Theater engagement and subsequent concerts right up until her death in June 1969 at age 47. Number 8. Harvey Keitel in Apocalypse Now, 1976. Harvey Keitel lasted approximately 1 week on Apocalypse Now before Francis Ford Coppola fired him in April 1976 during shooting in the Philippines. Coppola wanted Captain Willard to function as a passive onlooker observing the madness of war, but Keitel's approach ran more active and high energy. That creative mismatch sealed his fate. Coppola later explained that he could see Keitel was very uncomfortable with conditions in the jungle and thought about what 6 months of difficult shooting would be like for a city guy who seemed afraid of it. So he made the tough decision. Keitel challenged that characterization for decades. In 2021, he finally pushed back and pointed out that the book on the making of the movie claimed he didn't like the jungle and didn't want to stay there, but he had spent 3 years in the United States Marines Corps in the jungle. Martin Sheen arrived on April 24, 1976, and the production needed only 4 days to reshoot Keitel's footage. One shot of Keitel actually survives in the finished film, showing Willard walking from the helicopter to the boat, and it stayed because the sunset was too gorgeous to recreate. Keitel's career flourished in the years that followed. An Oscar nomination came for Bugsy, and he starred in Reservoir Dogs, Pulp Fiction, and Bad Lieutenant. Number 9. Eric Stoltz in Back to the Future, 1985. This stands as the most dramatic replacement in modern Hollywood history, and the way it happened makes it even worse. Eric Stoltz landed the role of Marty McFly after studio head Sid Sheinberg pushed for him following his performance in Mask. Michael J. Fox had been director Robert Zemeckis' first choice, but his commitment to family ties made him unavailable. Stoltz filmed for 5 to 6 weeks before the production reached its devastating conclusion. The problems ran deep. Stoltz approached the role dramatically and insisted the film was a tragedy, not a comedy. He demanded that everyone call him Marty at all times and never Eric, and he kept this up so consistently that co-star Christopher Lloyd genuinely believed the actor's name was Marty. One scene between Marty and Biff called for the characters to shove each other, and Thomas F. Wilson asked Stoltz to hold back a bit. Stoltz refused and shoved with full force, take after take, until Wilson's collarbones were bruised. January 7, 1985, brought the secret decision to replace him. But here's the cruel part. Filming continued for 3 more days without telling him. That footage was essentially technical rehearsal for Fox's scenes, and Stoltz had no idea he was already done. January 10, 1985, saw Stoltz arrive on set at 5:30 p.m. for what he believed was a normal shoot. After he finished his final scene feeding lines to Christopher Lloyd, Zemeckis pulled him aside. The director later described it as the hardest meeting of his life and said it was all his fault, and that he broke Stoltz's heart. The formal announcement came during the late-night lunch break, when Zemeckis spoke into his bullhorn and told everyone they had an announcement that was probably going to be shocking. Kind of good news and bad news. The bad news was that they had to reshoot most of the movie because they'd changed the cast, and there was going to be a new Marty in Michael J. Fox. $4 million was added to the $15 million budget because of the recasting. The film earned $390 million and spawned 2 sequels. In 2024, Fox reached out while writing his memoir and joked that if Stoltz's answer was "piss off" and "leave me alone," that worked too. Stoltz sent back what Fox called a beautifully written reply that opened with "piss off" and "leave me alone, I jest." If you made it this far, drop a comment letting me know which of these stories surprised you the most. And if you want more stories about the real Hollywood behind the glamour, make sure you're subscribed. I'll see you in the next one.